Welcome back. Well, I want to do a talk here about the least known fort on the Fort King Military Trail, going from Fort Brooke in Tampa Bay to Fort King in Ocala. So I want to talk about Fort McClure, which you've probably never heard of. There's nothing that remains of it today, not even a historical marker. And so if you look on the McKay-Blake map of 1839, you see the Fort King Road running right through the middle of the map. Fort King right there. Down here is Fort Armstrong, which I talked about last week. Fort Dade below that. And this is Fort McClure. You can see it's directly east of Fort Cooper and west of Lake Eustis. And it's right next to what's Miccosukee, their Miccosukee Lake or swamp. Uh, it's also called Warm Springs. It's supposed to be uh, at a spring that drains into the Miccosukee. I have a friend who's actually looking for the location, interested in maybe getting some support for a historical marker, and it's probably the uh, he's most primordial swamp that he's ever been in. So it's a very inhospitable, but let's talk about the history of it. Fort McClure, I don't have much. I went into the adjutant letters, and the commander of the fort was 1st Infantry Company B, commanded by is I think First Lieutenant Ferdinand Coxe, Coxe. He's from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And this letter he wrote from Fort McClure on February 1st, asking for the monthly returns. So apparently the fort's established as by February 1st, 1839. And so this was the first letter I found that he wrote from it. Otherwise, before and after, he was at Fort Marion in St. Augustine. And there's only 2 months of the monthly return. Lieutenant Ferdinand Coxe, 1st Infantry Company B, present 26 soldiers, absent, looks like 2 or 7, aggregate total, present and absent 36, total 39 aggregate. So his company is only really about half a company size, not very large detachment at all. Here's the officers, and Ferdinand Coxe, it looks like he's by himself. Commanding the post absent, Samuel Markin, it looks like, assistant quartermaster, and Seth Eastman is teaching at West Point, which is kind of neat. Seth Eastman was a famous artist too. In fact, let me show you this real quick. This is a book I just got from John Mary Lou Missile. His country has called him. This is a book about the officers who served in both the Seminole and the Civil Wars. There, the cover painting is by Seth Eastman. He apparently was commissioned by United States Congress to paint several forts, and that still sit in the halls of Congress today. Okay, so back to the post returns. And see how it was, is this? Okay. Next month, March 1839. For that, Company B, 25 present, total 35 and 38. Looks like they had 1 soldier discharged, no deaths listed. And just those 2 months, and the last letter we have is, of course, he's still the only officer there. The last letter we have by him dates, was this April? Oh, sorry, April 1839. And April 17th send it in return to the post. So we know Fort McClure was active as a military post from maybe late January 1839 to April, about 2.5 months existence. It's named after Second Lieutenant James McClure, who died at Fort Brooke, who was in the same regiment. So anyway, a little more interesting history. You'd think that's all the post history was. Well, turns out there's this guy, and this is the only painting we have of him, Halleck Tustenuggee. John T. Sprague has this picture in his book, The Florida War. Halleck Tustenuggee was a Miccosukee War Chief, probably one of the most fierce and brutal war chiefs in the Seminole War. He was, I think, underrated. He was like Coacucci and Osceola, but very brutal attacks that he did in the war. One where Mrs. Montgomery was killed, an officer's wife who got married 3 months before, and also attack on the 7th Infantry um, around Levy's Prairie near Miccosukee. He's credited with that, some brutal battles. So anyway, he's kind of the last war chief that the Army wanted to track down and remove from Florida. So Colonel Worth in April 1842 sent out an expedition to capture or, or destroy him or kill him, either one. So Colonel Worth goes off and fights a battle, the last large battle of the war, Battle of Palakaha. I think that means like a swampy place or something, um, which Abrahamstown was also called this, but from the description, it sounds like they're at Lake Apopka. So this is a very inaccurate artistic expression of it too. It was not all this glorious. There was one casualty, one soldier that got killed. His name was Private Wandell. Colonel Worth, after defeating Halleck Tustenuggee and driving him from the hammock where his village was secreted, established a camp at the former site of Fort McClure and called it Camp Wandell after the private that was killed. But even the newspaper articles call it Fort McClure or Warm Springs. The springs the fort was by. Of course, this is an artistic picture of General Worth going through the Everglades. It's probably a little more accurate than the last one. Halleck Tustenuggee has village just a few miles away from Fort McClure, and Colonel Worth was negotiating his removal from the territory again to go to Camp Tampa Bay, allowed the Miccosukees to come and go at the encampment. I don't think at this point there is much of a fort left in 1842 because it says camp and describes the Miccosukees coming in and wandering around the camp and going through the soldiers' tents. Uh, so I don't think there's no real fort walls or anything like that at this point. But Halleck Tustenuggee's village was nearby and would come in and get food and provisions and blankets. They said much more than his people could use. So he's obviously stocking up provisions, which was a common tactic among the not only him, but also Wildcat or Coacucci or some of the other chiefs at the time. Well, they wanted to get him to immigrate, but he was going to have no talk of it and refused to talk of it, in fact. But, they let the people come and go. So Colonel Worth, he kind of came up with a plan. He told Colonel Garland, said that when you're at the fort, when you feel time is right, just round up the Indians that are there in the encampment and send them down to Tampa Bay. Well, Colonel Worth went up to Fort King and told Hal Tustenuggee to come up there. He has more supplies, and also there's gunpowder and lead, that he could trade with there. So Halleck Tustenuggee goes up there, and after about 3 days, Colonel Garland pulls the trap and surrounds the Miccosukees and captures them at the Fort McClure area or Camp Wandell. And meanwhile, Halleck Tustenuggee is captured at Fort King, or actually they close the doors and surround him and can't get out and make him a prisoner. And he gets in such a rage that he passes out. Um, and but that and he's and his people are sent to Indian Territory, Oklahoma out west, where they actually uh, are have a prominent role in the Civil War. That Halleck Tustenuggee is actually, I believe, with the Union Army. An important part, the Battle of Round Mountain, I believe it is, and not sure what happened to him after that. He may have died during that very cold march to Kansas, where many of the Seminoles first death in 1862, 1863. So a sad ending on that. But he also had returned during the Third Seminole War to negotiate with Billy Bowlegs. So, quite a prominent chief, which I don't think gives enough credit, as famous as he was. Anyway, it's called the Battle of Palacocaha, and large battle, about 800 troops involved in that. Very large battle at the end of the war. And after that, Colonel Worth decided that the war was over and he was allowed to end the war at that point. So the orders were issued, and in August 1842, the Second Seminole War ended. Colonel Worth, he was the last major commander in the Second Seminole War in Florida, but he stayed in Florida for about 3 more years. He was in Florida about 5 years, and then went to Mexico. And I think he actually died coming back from Mexico of cholera. His wife and daughter are buried in St. Augustine because his daughter married John T. Sprague. And here's a newspaper article from the Charleston Mercury about notice at the top. It says Camp Warm Springs, Fort McClure. This is 3 days after the battle. Said about their losses and how expand are now within a few miles of the camp. Another account said they are only 3 miles, not 9 miles. And here's another news clipping, very short one, later, and this was from late May of 1839, said Halleck Tustenuggee has surrendered. Well, actually, he was surrounded and captured. He didn't ever surrender. And so that's the interesting history of Fort McClure. And it certainly would deserve a historical marker if that can be arranged. And it's the last minor fort on the Fort King Road, and the next fort up would be Fort King. So I found this interesting, and I hope you found this interesting too. And that's all for now.